In the darkness of polio's grip, Dr. Jonas Salk's vaccine stopped its cruel dance, leaving us with hope for a brighter future free from the chains of polio. We're joined today by Dr. Peter Salk, who's none other than the son of Dr. Jonas Salk, who invented the polio vaccine. Good afternoon, Dr. Salk. It's nice to have you with us today.
Thank you, Robbie. I'm glad to be here.
Thank you for taking the time. Uh, Now, I just wanted to start off by asking you. You were one of the first set of kids to have received the polio vaccine, right? I learned that your dad actually brought the vaccine one day home, and then vaccinated you and your brothers. What do you remember about that moment?
Sure. Let me put it in a bit of perspective, which is that my father and his team, this was a team effort at the University of Pittsburgh, had been working with the polio virus as part of an overall program and saw the opportunity to move forward with creating a vaccine based on the use of a killed virus, chemically inactivated virus. They did experiments in animals in their laboratory that were very encouraging in terms of the ability of that preparation to increase antibody responses, to induce antibody responses to the virus. And since the antibodies would be protective against the virus getting to the nervous system and causing paralysis, it was clear that this approach was very likely to succeed. The very first experiments that were done in children took place in the summer of 1952 at the Watson Home, the D.T. Watson Home for Crippled Children, just outside of Pittsburgh. Um, I should have my numbers in front of me. There was something on the order of 60-odd children involved in those experiments. And the reason for that was to be able to initially to inject kids who already had polio with virus of the same type, immunologic type. There are three different immunologic types that had caused their disease. And that was a safety measure, because if there was any possibility that they might contract polio from the inactivated preparation, very unlikely. But if there were, that would be eliminated by that way of procedure. And that would also allow one to see were there any other potential dangers that might show up. So that was the beginning. And those early experiments were followed by experiments at another facility in which children were involved. So that was all in 1952. Based on very encouraging results seen in those studies, it became apparent to my father that it was time to begin to increase the number of subjects in order to move towards a definitive trial of the effectiveness, the actual effectiveness in real life of the vaccine. Would it indeed protect against polio infection and paralysis? It was at that point of transition, just before expanding the trials, that we, the family, were injected. And I think that this was in May of 1953. I think that my father's intention at that point this was part of an expanded team, so to speak, because the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis, this as is well known as the March of Dimes, which was its fundraising effort, was responsible for funding the program and helping structure it and so on. And I think that it was important in their view and on my father's part to demonstrate his confidence in this experimental vaccine preparation by injecting his own family. And I think I see my mother in their background here. The feeling in the family was it's time to protect our own children. So that's I'm just placing it now in the context of the overall arch of things. And yes, I absolutely remember that experience. And when my father brought the vaccine home, and the equipment that is not among my favorite object lists, which was the syringes and the needles, which he sterilized on the kitchen stove, and lined up his family and gave us injections. And none of us as children, and two younger brothers, were enamored of that experience. And why I remember it so clearly is that for some bizarre reason, that particular day, the injection didn't hurt. I couldn't feel anything going in. And that somehow emblazoned the experience in my mind.
Wow. I I also read that he had the struggle between you know trying he was pulled apart by two different thoughts, which is to help vaccinate as many kids as possible, but at the same time to be fair to everyone who's waiting out there. But then finally he decided, no, even one single child that he could save, I learned that he wanted to actually go ahead and do that, and he actually started to uh, share the vaccine with a few other families as well. I kind of read about that.
Yeah, I don't know the exact timing when we lived in the country at that point outside of Pittsburgh. They, a few surrounding neighbors, and I know that they were injected rather early on too. It could have been somewhere very close to that same point in time.
Okay. And so now, just to go back in time, right? My understanding is Dr. Salk helped develop the flu vaccine, right? Back when he was in Michigan. And then once he started to move to uh, Pittsburgh, once he moved to Pittsburgh, then that is when he started focusing on the polio vaccine. Now, do you have any insights into the motivation behind going after polio?
Yes, and again, what I think I'll do is step back just a little bit to give you this additional perspective. When he was in medical school, and I believe it was his first year taking a microbiology course, in one lecture, the professor explained that for two bacterial diseases, diphtheria and tetanus, it was possible to protect against those diseases by using the chemical toxin, the poison that these bacteria produced, and chemically inactivate it so that it no longer was toxic. But even after that chemical modification, it still was able, if injected, to induce an antibody response that would then protect against the real toxin if that ever was encountered. So that was the first lecture. This next lecture had to do with viral illnesses, such as influenza. And the professor's statement was that you couldn't do that kind of thing with a viral illness because in order to develop a protective immune response, the body had to experience an actual infection by the virus. And my father just couldn't understand, based on his understanding of how the whatever understandings there could be at that point about how the immune system worked, why should that be? And he asked the professor, how come? And the professor's answer was basically just because. And what that left my father feeling was both of these statements can't be true. That you can do it one way with the bacterial diseases and you can't do it that way with the viral diseases. And he had the good fortune to be able to work during, I think it may have been his last year of medical school, with one of the professors there, whose name was Thomas Francis Junley, who had the same sort of point of view that my father did. And he worked with Dr. Francis in medical school to begin studies having to do with the possibility of creating an inactivated virus vaccine against influenza. Then my father went into his clinical training for 2 years. And after that, we ended up going to the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, where Dr. Francis had gone to head up, I believe, the Department of Epidemiology. And it was there that he worked with Dr. Francis as a very important part of the team to develop what turned out to be the first vaccine against influenza based on the use of inactivated virus preparation. And that vaccine was introduced for use in the military at the end of World War II. After several more years, my father had a hankering to become more independent, had an opportunity to come to the University of Pittsburgh to establish a virus research laboratory, intending to continue his work with influenza and improve upon the vaccine in various ways, but then was approached by the director of research for the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis, Marcia Dines, to see if my father would join in on a collaborative effort to determine definitively how many different immunologic types of poliovirus existed. Because if you had wanted to have a vaccine that would protect against the disease, you needed to include all of the different types. So my father did that, and that started the ball rolling.
And I was just looking up the clinical trial results, before this call. It's amazing that for I believe for type 2 it was like 100% success, right? And then type 3 it was 92%, and then for type 1 it was 68, and that was attributed to the misformulation by the pharmaceutical companies. That level of success is just amazing, especially in those times. And it was one of the largest clinical trials ever uh, conducted, right, in the history of mankind. And, and there was one moment that stood out for me, which is when Dr. Salk actually goes to a local school, and on that particular day, he goes all by himself without his colleagues, and he forgets to take the candy that he always used to hand over to the kids. But then, so all he could do was simply say thank you to the kids, after vaccinating them. But towards the end, when he does that, a little girl, she, after getting vaccinated, she walks away, but then turns back and then walks up to him and then says thank you and then gives him a hug. That to me, it just stood out. So similarly, are there any personal favorites of yours, as far as these anecdotes are concerned?
Yeah. Okay. Now you asked along with the preface like some questions that hold up that make me want to reply to different facets of it. So if it's okay, and I'm not sure I will remember all of them, let me start with the first thing that you had said, which had to do with the effectiveness of the vaccine in that first clinical trial. It wasn't that was the lower effectiveness of the type 1 was not the responsibility of the pharmaceutical companies. That was the responsibility of the federal government. And
Ah,
and the story behind that was that the um, people responsible on the side of the government wanted to have merthiolate, a preservative, added to the vaccine. That made my father very nervous because the preparation had never been tested with merthiolate included. And he was concerned that the merthiolate might have a damaging effect on the vaccine. So there was no choice. It had to be done that way. And as things moved forward, my father in his laboratory and his coworkers began to test what was the effect of merthiolate on the potency of the vaccine. And to their dismay, it turned out that the virus, especially the type 1 virus, was extremely sensitive to methylate, and that the potency degraded for type 1 especially very rapidly every time. So here we have a situation where the clinical trial that involved just short of 2 million children had started at the end of April in 1954. Children were already injected, and it took a whole year for the results of that field trial to be analyzed and then announced. And just as a coincidence, the person responsible for that part of the program was the same Thomas Francis Jr., with whom my father had worked. He was in charge of the evaluation of the field trial. During that entire year, my father, he kept Dr. Francis kept everything to himself, his colleagues, his operation. And my father had no idea what the outcome was going to be. The day of the announcement of the results, April 12th of 1955, which was done in Ann Arbor, my father and his family, we were there as well, arrived, and it was only at breakfast that morning when my father learned that the trial had been successful. But as you've mentioned, there was a residual effect that took some of the blush away, so to speak, as a result of the Messiah at it. So I wanted to just put that part of the story to rest. As far as the anecdote, I think that was extremely touching. There must have been some people other than being alone in that scene, because there would be people there to make sure that the kids were lined up and so on. But whatever it was, if the candy had been left behind, I'm sure the way you described it is the way that this took place. And it's just extremely touching. It's those kinds of experiences where there was this human interaction that really was very meaningful to my father, and I can just feel it in myself how much the pleasure and satisfaction that response on the part of that little girl would have given him.
When do you think it actually uh, sunk in for him? Because the, I mean, I've seen firsthand. When I was young, a few kids in my neighborhood who were polio stricken, and I've seen what it does to kids. It basically robs them of their childhood, and it robs families of the happiness. It's such a so that's why when someone actually came up with a vaccine, right? And it was such a relief to not just here for Americans, for people all over the world. And but I understood that there was always this scientific tussle or competition, if I may put it that way, between the vaccine that Dr. Salk was developing, and then there was this other school which was to actually go with a live but weakened form of virus, which Dr. Sabin came up with. And for and then I also learned that obviously Dr. Salk's vaccine was the first one that was approved and was being used, but Dr. Sabin's was much more convenient, especially for countries in the other parts of the world, because it was too expensive to buy syringes. But isn't it amazing that pretty much most of the countries have actually stopped using the drops version of the polio vaccine, popularly called as polio drops, right? And then now they've actually gone back to Dr. Salk's vaccine. Can you do you have any insights into the science behind that?
Yes. Um, so you're right. There were two very different points of view about how to make a vaccine. And my father was, as I've mentioned, using a kill virus. And Dr. Sadin was part of the school of thinking, as really had my father's professor been, that only a live virus vaccine would be effective, and that if there were any kind of comparison, it would be superior in every single conceivable way. So what ended up happening, without going through all of the details, is that it took longer for Dr. Sadin to get a vaccine preparation ready for clinical testing. By the time that happened, my father, the vaccine produced by my father and his team, had already been introduced. In fact, the results that we have talked about were announced on April 12th of 1955, and the vaccine was approved for use that evening, on which was, and if you think back from the present day, that was rather extraordinary. So from 1955 through somewhat shorter in early 1960, and Dr. Sabin was wanting to experiment with his vaccine. The United States was no longer really an option because so many people had already been vaccinated. And what ended up happening was Dr. Sabin went to Russia. Russia wanted him, the USSR at that point, to have his vaccine tested there, and that's what took place. The results were reported to be very positive and favorable. And based on that, Dr. Sabin's vaccine subsequently was introduced here in this country in 1961. Let me put that in a bit of perspective because I think that it's useful. By 1961, the incidence of polio in this country, which had reached a peak in 1952, 3 years prior to the introduction of the vaccine, in which there was something just shy of 58,000 cases of polio in this country. So compared to the 4 years before the vaccine was introduced in 1955, by 1961, the incidence of polio in the United States was reduced by 97%. So the job was close to complete. Dr. Sabin's vaccine came in and was introduced with a lot of what I would best describe as hype. This is God's gift to mankind. It's going to be so much better in all respects, more potent, longer lasting immunity, et cetera, et cetera. And it is bought in that way. And of course, I mean, if I were a kid, I would much rather have some drops and a sugar cube, which is what was done at that point, than something injected. Question is whether it really was necessary to make that transition. You're absolutely right. There have been aspects of its use, particularly more developing countries, in terms of cost and ease of administration, that had ended up making it a vaccine of choice for a program ultimately to attempt to eradicate polio globally. Whether that was necessary in this country or not is another question. And one of my father's big concerns with the live virus approach is that the weakened viruses used in that vaccine, which were designed to cause an infection in the individual, that would not go on to have the virus invade the nervous system and kill the nerve cells and produce paralysis. So that was the design of the vaccine. My father was concerned about the stability of the mutations that weakened the virus. Would there be a possibility that they could somehow, that the weakened or fancy what is attenuated viruses could revert to a more virulent, neurovariant effect in the nervous system at the form? And that's exactly what ended up happening. From the very first moment that the live vaccine was introduced in this country, it started to produce, there were cases of polio developed in children who received the vaccine or older individuals who received the vaccine, and close contacts, for example, mothers changing diapers. The virus grows in the intestinal tract, comes out in the bowel movements, and that would be a very easy and natural way for the virus to get transmitted to a parent, for example. So that started immediately. And for the next entire part of the history where the live vaccine was used in this country, there was something like 10 to 12 cases of polio every year caused by the virus in recipients of those cats. I've had conversations with one of the people who was part of the committee, always considering what to do and how to handle vaccine decisions. What ended up happening was that after some short period of time, my father's vaccine, the vaccine of my father and his team was no longer even obtainable in the United States. Only the live vaccine was available. And my father was really concerned about that because of this untoward side effect, so to speak, on when parents weren't given a choice. There wasn't anything said to a parent like, there's another option. You can get a shot and then you'll be completely safe, no risks. So this was just done by fiat, so to speak. It happened, and the regulatory committees, so that let's call it that, and were really afraid. What if all of this hype was true? What if this oral vaccine really was far superior and longer lasting immunity and more potent and so on and so on? What if we were to make the decision to go back to the injected vaccine and it was a terrible mistake? So the fear persisted. And it was only in the year 2000 that the decision, a couple of years before that, but the effect took place. It was only in 2000 that this country stopped using the oral vaccine and went back entirely and exclusively to the use of the injected vaccine because of this safety issue. And that has been the case in many other industrialized countries that could afford to the injected preparation, and they made the same decision because of the safety feature. You can see I can never answer a question. Go ahead.
No, thank you. Actually, well, for me, you know, what made what makes Dr. Salk so endearing personally for me is the fact that refused to patent the vaccine. And you know what happened during the last pandemic, right? Companies made billions of dollars selling the COVID 19 vaccines. So I'm just looking back and wondering, like, wow, that was quite a decision, right? But has he ever discussed that about with the family?
So here's the story as I understand it. Number one, my father had no interest in profiting from the vaccine, which was not on his agenda. His focus was entirely on being of service to humanity, and that was his goal. So the other issue here is that the fact of the matter is this was not his decision to make. He was not in the position of deciding, oh, I'm going to patent the vaccine. The responsibility was in the hands of the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis. And in fact, the NFIP did look into the possibility of patenting the vaccine. And I don't really know why. I cannot imagine that it was in any way for the sake of profiting from it, whether it had to do with being more fully in control of manufacturing, quality control, etc. I don't really know, or whether there was any issue in their mind of putting any money that might come in back into the programs that they were supporting. That I don't know. What I do know is that my father wanted nothing to do with this, which was very hard on the part of the patent attorney that the NFIP had retained, because he needed access to my father to answer questions that he needed to know about the possibility of establishing a patent. And he had an impossible time getting my father to sit down with him. Finally, after whatever pleadings took place with the National Foundation, etc., my father did agree to meet with him. And I must say, I was rather shocked one day when I was looking through the archives of a portion of the collection of his papers at the library of the University of California, San Diego, for some other issues, and stumbled across a patent application with markings in my father's hand, editing and so on. And I thought, well, what is going on here? This isn't consistent with anything I understood. And finally, I have been in touch with the archivist at the National, at the March of Dimes, and who have provided some papers from their archives and so on, which gave some of the coloring that I've already just now shared with you. And what became apparent to me is this was an era in which there were no copy machines. That paper with his writing on it remained in his hands. This was not something that he provided to the patent attorney. It was there for a discussion. And my father I share that, and it's hard for him to keep his hand from moving when he's reading something and making notes to clarify his own thinking about things. So clearly, these were the notes that my father was using during that meeting that he finally agreed to have with the patent attorney. So that's as I see it, you may, from your own side, ask about the following, which is that famous, relatively well-known moment, the evening after the announcement was made about the results of the field trial, when Edward R. Murrow, the newscaster, asked my father, Dr. Salk, who owns the patent to this vaccine? And it's just an amazing clip to me because as I watch it, I see this sort of light come up, over my father's face as this idea sort of emerged. And his answer was, well, the people, I would say, there is no patent. Could you patent the sun? And, this was, this is part of my father's nature in a way of sort of visualizing things. And so, bottom line, it wasn't that he refused to patent it. He had no right to refuse. This was not his position. He had no interest at all.
Well, thanks for sharing that. I'm better informed now. You just mentioned Edward R. Murrow, right? So I'm just going to read something that Edward R. Murrow actually, you know, uh, told your dad. I'm just reading this off of the book. He says to Dr. Jonas Salk, "Young man, a great tragedy has befallen you. You've lost your anonymity." So, how did your father feel about all the, all the commotion after?
Yeah. Oh, it was, I would say that it was a mixed blessing, so to speak, this whole experience. The commotion immediately afterwards was terribly difficult for him. We couldn't immediately get back to his laboratory to do any work because of all the flood of communications and so on and so forth, and report reviews and whatnot. So it was a very difficult moment for him initially. And I think what he attempted to do in his life was to make the most constructive use he could of the opportunities that might be available to continue to make contributions to humanity and its well-being based on the recognition it had come as a result of this effort with the polio vaccine.
And there's one other thing that kind of stood out for me in the book, but for which I couldn't find an answer. So I'm going to ask you that the day the clinical trial results were announced, in that meeting, right? Dr. Salk was, I believe, was the last person to speak. So he goes on, and he starts, thanking all the other people from different organizations who were involved. And But somehow he, forgets to mention his own team members, which kind of is like a cloud hanging. I think it was that way for a while, right? And for me personally, I thought, well, he was just hearing the results that day, just like anyone else. So he was, for me, I thought he was still processing everything. And so there was so much going on in his mind. So it was simply, just his memory playing a trick on him. But I wanted to ask you that, what would you say, or do you have any insights into the reason why he did not mention his lab mates?
Yeah, he did in a way that was meaningful to him, which was acknowledging all of the people that had worked on the project and how each one would have the satisfaction of what of what had taken place. I can see that from the context of some of his worldview in terms of making a statement about the sun, the pattern of the sun, or what have you. So for him to say something that would be expansive like that about each person having the satisfaction of having made the contributions that they did would register internally as being meaningful. It was extremely hurtful to the people in the laboratory who had done so much to put their heart and their soul into this effort that involved working around the clock at times, etc., and not to have each of the individual names mentioned. That was a terrible mistake from my vantage point on my father's part. I feel so badly for the people and the hurt they carried away afterwards. And the only thing I can say is that I don't think that my mother would have read that speech to give him advice, because I don't think she would have um, allowed him not to redo that portion of what he was about to say. Um, I'm sorry for everyone, and I there's really nothing more to more to say than that. My father did appreciate so deeply everything that everyone did, and I think that it would have been so much better just to be just to deal in a straightforward way by naming people rather than elevating that to some sort of a universal statement of
No, I
appreciation.
mean, it sure did come across as unintentional because in the speech, he never spoke about himself too. He never said, "Oh, I did this, I did that." He was just focusing on the other folks, right? So I think it was purely unintentional. But thank you for sharing your insights. Just the other day, I drove by the spot where your home once was. It's sad that it isn't there anymore. It's just a parking lot now. But at least, I appreciated the fact that they have a small historical marker. So I kind of went there and kind of, said my thanks. But you know from your experience, have you personally seen people like come up to your dad and just talk to him, or share their feelings, sentiments with him? Meaning, have you personally experienced that?
Yeah, I'd say that.
Okay,
Not much to say
okay.
about it except that, yes, of course, many people had such feelings of gratitude for the fear having been lifted. It was so pervasive in this country and around the world about this disease. And that was probably the most remarkable thing about that accomplishment was the lifting of fear.
And around the world now, the number is approaching zero, right? We are going to hopefully soon be a polio free world, and at that time, right, uh, I would definitely think of Dr. Salk, and uh, I just don't have enough words in my vocabulary to express my gratitude. I guess I'm speaking for so many others as well. um, because I don't think I'm exaggerating or overstating by saying that if I'm able to walk and run today, it's probably because of two things. One, luck. The other is the polio vaccine. Right? So now, um, coming to how you are trying to preserve and maintain his legacy. I know there's a Salk Institute. Can you talk a little bit about what the institute does?
Sure. Let me let me say a few things as a transition. Okay. First, about the prospects for eradication of polio, because this has been a focus for the world, and starting in 1988, based on several prior years' work by Rotary International. There was a global polio eradication initiative that was established with WHO's and some other organizations, with the focus of eradicating polio. The initial desire and intention was, well, I should say one other thing in preface, which was that the world had just come through the successful eradication of the first and so far only human disease that's been eradicated, which was smallpox. That was agreed at the end of the 1970s. And so the hope was, let's now do the same thing with polio. It's a complicated story. The initial goal was that polio would be eradicated by the year 2000. That didn't happen. Things plateaued. There are many different reasons for the fact that the program is still underway and has not yet reached the end goal. Part of the problem is societal, in a sense, in terms of getting the vaccine out into all of the recipients necessary vaccines, I should put it in the plural. And the other is still in the realm of science, which is that, as you said, the oral vaccine is easier to use, less expensive, and so on, and really became the mainstay of the global eradication effort. But it has the problems that I've described before about its ability on admittedly, its rare occasions causing polio in vaccine recipients or their contacts. And what became apparent starting around the year 2000 was that it also had the capacity, the virus, to mutate back to a dangerous form and spread in the community, accumulate additional mutations and so on. And so I'll just put in a couple of more scientific words, so to speak. If the live vaccine ends up causing polio in a recipient or their close contacts, that's called vaccine-associated paralytic polio, or VAPP for short. If it causes polio by virtue of a reverting virus circulating and then causing polio within the community, that's called circulating vaccine-derived. Well, the virus that causes the polio, circulating vaccine-derived poliovirus, or CVDPP. Both of those phenomena have continued to take place. So where we stand today, and I can say a few more things, but just to take this to its present moment, as of last year, there were 12 cases of paralytic polio in the world caused by the original naturally occurring wild poliovirus in just two countries, Pakistan and Afghanistan. There were 505 cases of polio caused by the vaccine-derived poliovirus that was circulating in the communities, and last year that occurred in 23 countries. So there's a fundamental problem with using the original live vaccine because of its ability to revert. And there's a polio vaccine expert, Vincent Marconiello, who said in one of his podcasts, the interview programs back, I think it was in 2015, that what's now known is that in every single recipient of the live vaccine, the virus mutates in the intestinal tract where it grows, and within days results in the appearance of a virus that's more neurovirulent than the virus contained in the vaccine. In every case, it's very rare that polio is caused in the recipient, but as you can see today, and in addition to those 505 cases, I don't actually have a hard figure for the number of cases of vaccine-associated paralytic polio. It's most likely still in the range of several hundred. So 98% approximately of polio in the world today is vaccine-related. There has been a move to develop a new oral polio vaccine, NOPV, based on techniques that are now available that weren't available in Dr. Sabian's day. And this new OPV that at least the one that's in use now is directed against the type 2 virus, which is the one that is most responsible for these cases of circulating vaccine-derived polio. And I don't know whether it's completely free of the ability to cause polio itself, or whether it's just greatly reduced. And perhaps that's known. I'm not on top of that at the moment, but certainly it's much, much safer than the oral vaccine. There's another little twist here. I'm just going to add this into the mix of the conversation, which is that, as I said, the original hype about the oral vaccine was its greater potency, and so on and so forth. That just doesn't turn out to be the case. Or indeed, uh, in Afghanistan in 2018, when the number of cases of polio caused by the wild polio virus were analyzed, it turns out that there are 21 such cases. 7 of those cases, or 1/3 of the cases, took place in kids who had received at least 7 doses of the oral vaccine. So this is not a vaccine that in all parts of the world is effective. They are maximally, optimally effective. And I don't really understand completely the reasons, whether it may be due to malnutrition, enteropathy, which is something that affects the intestinal tract and may reduce the effectiveness of the vaccine, whether there are other intestinal viruses in those locales that compete with the vaccine virus. Whatever it is, there are parts of the world in which it's just plain does not work as it is intended to work. And there was another study that was done in Nigeria quite some time ago, which compared the injected vaccine and the oral vaccine. And what turned out was that the number of kids who'd received 3 doses of one or the other of those vaccines, the injected vaccine were quite potent, 98% of the kids, something like that. And the oral vaccine with 2 of the different types was less than 50% effective. So just to say that we're okay, I'm going to say one more thing just to add to the complexity, which is one of the ways in which the oral vaccine does do better than the injected vaccine has to do with so-called intestinal immunity. Because the virus grows directly in the intestinal tract, there's a local immunity produced in the intestinal tract. That means when a person's been vaccinated with the oral vaccine, and if a virus gets in the mouth and tries to grow in the intestinal tract, it will be killed right in the intestinal tract itself and not be excreted to be passed on within the community. The injected vaccine, it also does have some effect in the intestinal tract, but it's only about 95% as effective, at least the oral vaccine. The way both vaccines work to protect against the virus getting into the brain is that antibodies are produced in the bloodstream. So if the virus gets from your intestinal tract into the blood and from there heading to the brain and the spinal cord, it can't make it because the antibodies in the bloodstream will neutralize it. So that's what the injected vaccine does successfully. And the open question, at least in my mind, for quite some time had been, does this 5% edge that the live vaccine has over the injected vaccine, does that really make a difference in reality? And the answer became clear in 2013 when Israel experienced the following. Israel has, as had other countries by that point, had switched entirely to the injected vaccine. And they began at one point in 2013 to detect wild poliovirus coming from Pakistan in the sewage, and analyzing stool samples from individuals who had been fully immunized with the injected vaccine could find live wild poliovirus in the streets. No one in Israel was paralyzed. The vaccine did its job, kept the virus from getting from your intestinal tract to the blood and to your nervous system. But in this day and age, when eradicating the virus is the target, this wasn't enough. So here we have 2 vaccines both of which are effective, each of which has drawbacks. The live vaccine has the drawback of not only being not so effective in some parts of the world, but also the danger of causing polio. Maybe that will be handled with this new vaccine. I can't imagine that the new vaccine, I may be wrong, but I can't imagine that it will be any more effective in those parts where there's something else going on in the intestinal tract or what have you. That remains to be seen. So the live vaccine has its drawbacks, and the COVID vaccine has its drawbacks. So we've got a little bit of a juggling act. Probably the best way of proceeding is to combine the two in a sense. Introduce the injected vaccine in the routine immunization programs of every country. And in addition, be using the live vaccine. This may be the best way to go, but it's an open question. How long is it going to take? What other improvements may be necessary before we're finally at the end of this really important undertaking?
And about the Salk Institute.
Okay, and thank you so much for getting me back on track. Um,
Sure, sure. No,
um, what, and again, forgive me. I'll give you the long story, and then
please.
you edit it down to the to
Mhm.
the short version. 2 years after the vaccine was introduced, my father began thinking about a new institute for experimental medicine, and his intention was that this would be at the University of Pittsburgh. He was working, and that it would be focusing on traditional areas of experimental medicine in terms of vaccines, infectious disease, diabetes, et cetera, cancer. And but the interesting thing to me, looking at some of his original writings about this, was that he was anticipating that the kinds of people who might be drawn to work in this new Institute for Experimental Medicine would also be drawn to working upon and considering problems that, and this is synthesizing a phrase, it's in his writings, the problems that arise from man's relationship to man. This had to do with the much broader aspect of my father's thinking about humanity. The Institute never was able to be set up at the University of Pittsburgh for a variety of reasons. My father ended up establishing it in La Jolla, California. This is supposed to be called the Institute for Biology at Torrey Pines. This was the location in La Jolla. This was his desire. The National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis, Marching Times, which had been providing funding for the initial establishment of the Institute. They have no, your name needs to be on this if they're going to raise money for it. And the institute is now the Salk Institute for Biological Studies. It started very small and it's continued to expand. It does work in many different areas of fundamental biology for the sake of establishing new bases for advances in treatment, prevention, etc., including the immune system, cancer, aging. I mean, they'll read many things out. I'm sure plant biology at this point, regenerative medicine, stem cell work, etc. It really become a very well-known and institute for experimental biology, and has indeed made substantial contributions to approaching treatment and prevention of various diseases. My father's dream that this institute would also approach some of these overarching issues related for humanity, related to things such as war, poverty, environmental, well, some of the environmental issues are being incorporated, plant biology, so on. But that fundamental desire that my father had never came to fruition at the Institute. And so perhaps yes, that's a partial answer to your question.
And as we wrap up, what is the most important message we can carry forward from your father's life and work?
Okay. I think there are several things. He approached everything that he did with the intention of making a contribution that would be meaningful and significant. After the vaccine, He went on to work in his own laboratory, directed towards cancer and the potential use of the immune system to help with cancer prevention or treatment. I worked with him for not quite 13 years, primarily on that project. He had a project on the use of a molecule of myelin-basic protein for the treatment of multiple sclerosis that came into a clinical program. I had with that bit also. Later in his life, he was focused on work on an HIV vaccine against HIV/AIDS, starting in the context of people who already had been affected and using the immune system to delay the progression of the disease. Now, this will be a comment to be edited out, but help me put the needle back on the factory to answer your question in the spirit. Oh, so the take home lessons as far as my father's life is concerned. So he everything even the institute itself was a project from the heart and of art. He collaborated with Louis Kahn, as a well-known architect, and together the a remarkable building in La Jolla. Everything he did, he put his heart and soul in, and everything was focused towards helping humanity. That was the way this life worked. And in addition, he spent a good deal of his time thinking about and writing about the dynamics that were at play in our present moment in the scheme of things, of the process of human evolution, and what we needed to do as a species if we were going to be successful at making the transition from a time in our history when competition prevailed, where people were sort of out for one's own gain, towards a point where we were acting cooperatively for the sake of humanity as a whole. He used an image which had to do with world population, in which population, I mean, I can get my hand visible somewhere, and I'll go in this backwards direction. The population for so long just hovered around in very low, relatively low range, and then several hundred years ago, just began to take off. And it's at a point where it can't keep going forever at that rate. And there's back when he was talking about this, and towards the beginning of the 1980s, even in the 1970s, it made the options were you can't keep going forever on a finite planet. We would not want to see the population crash because we've used up all of our resources, or through some phenomenon not getting along with each other that might result, say, in nuclear war. What he wanted to see was this natural process of an S-shaped curve or a sigmoid curve, where the population would plateau and reach an equilibrium. And the way he was thinking was that the forces that were driving our evolutionary trajectory would be different in what he termed epoch A, this early phase where the emphasis is on growth, to epoch B, where the emphasis needs to be on sustainability, say it this way. I won't go into any of the deeper aspects of that thinking. So to get directly to your question about the implications of my father's life and history for humanity in the future, I think I would sum it up in a sense with a phrase that he used. He did have an experience in India, where he was the recipient of the Jawaharlal Nehru Award for International Understanding. I believe that was in 1977. And the acceptance speech that he gave on that occasion had the following as a title: "Are we being good ancestors?" I think that this is the perspective in which I would see my father's life. To do what we can. We are so many different people, So many different personalities, so many different skills. What can each of us do to contribute to humanity in the best way we can, whether it's within our family, our neighborhood, our community, our city, our country, globally, whatever our skill sets are, if our hearts are in the right place and our minds are in the right place, and we can devote ourselves to whatever extent we can to making our sphere of life, a series of spheres, the best we can, and become not just, as he would put them, good citizens of the world today, but also good ancestors for the future. To me, that's what really triggers feeling in me in terms of what is the meaning of this man's life. It's to have that as as the overarching perspectives and to act as best one can in accordance with that overview.
And I can tell you this: if I had met your father, I would have prostrated at his feet. That's the ultimate form of respect in my culture, and I truly, yeah. So I can't thank him enough. So from humanity to your family, thank you. So just a few more questions. Now this is like thematic questions that we ask all our guests. So if you could inject one dose of scientific curiosity into every person, what would it be?
Okay, this will sound very strange, um, but I just reviewed this a few days ago. This paper that I had written with my father back in 1982. It was for a UNESCO conference. He'd been invited to make a contribution to it, and it had to do with solving world problems. And he turned the task over to me to structure something. And this was one of the high points of my experience of working with him, because he had written so many different papers and books on subjects that related to this. And what ended up coming out was a sequential, sort of presentation of the various aspects of his point of view. And the title of that manuscript was "An Evolutionary Approach to World Problems." And without going through the various themes, I'll just say this: that my father saw evolution as taking place in three different realms. There was an initial realm, once the universe came into being, of pre-biological evolution, before there were anything was living, so to speak. And then that phase led to the development into atoms and molecules and stars and galaxies and so on. And then at whatever point life appeared. And that was the point at which biological evolution began. And that led to self-replicating molecules, to single-cell organisms, to multi-cell organisms, um, and that phase of evolution. That's what we generally think of when we talk about evolution, is like Darwinian evolution. That's the biological phase of evolution. But then he saw that the phase of evolution that we're in now, he called meta-biological evolution. And that phase is concerned with our thinking and the products of our mind, and all of the different societal structures and so on that take place in which we live. So his focus, yes, there's the pre-biological phase of evolution and biological phase, the knowledge that he's gained in those realms that have allowed us to do so many things. We need to understand this metabiological phase of evolution if we're going to contribute successfully to creating the kind of social interactions that will support our human family in the optimal way. And he identified different drivers of evolution in the different realms and different properties. And I won't go into all of that aspect of thinking, but what became clear to me was, and this was in using my father's own language, that the main drive and realm in which evolution was taking place was on the level of consciousness in this metabiological phase. And it seemed to me that the same principles would hold true, and my father outlined this himself, that if one can understand the fundamental elements in the pre-biological phase, one gains the capacity to make contributions scientifically in those realms, understand the drivers in the mechanics of evolution, the biological phase, the same. And so in the metabiological phase, what struck me personally, and I think it was something like this that was the last sentence in that manuscript, was that what's necessary for us now at this moment in our evolutionary history is to develop a science of consciousness that can be allow us to do in the realm of metabiology what is being done in the other two pre-biological and biological realms. So, and if your question, if I'm remembering it correctly, and I may not have the part injecting a dose of scientific curiosity, from my vantage point, it would have to do with consciousness, because this is at the heart of our experience as human beings and the impact that we have not only within our society, but ultimately, depending on how the future goes and in the cosmos as a whole. I think it's really important for us to understand what is our subjective experience? Where does it come from? How does it relate? How is it contributing? What are the mechanics? How can we influence our own consciousness in the best ways for ourselves as individuals and as for positive contributions in society? And are there ways in which operating on that, what I see as a very fundamental level of nature, are there things that can be done that will massively amplify a constructive effect? And I won't go into details there at all at this point, but just to say that if there's anything that I would love to see injected as a dose of scientific curiosity, it would be, okay, what's going on here? And what can we do as individuals to take advantage of prospects in that realm and to contribute in that realm?
I'll tell you this, it's not strange at all. It's deep and intriguing, but definitely not strange. And I'm sure it resonates with many cultures around the world. And that is the answer that we're all trying to seek, right? And so, but thank you for sharing that. Now, can you recommend a book or two to our listeners related to either science or nonfiction?
Yeah. Well, the thing that came into my mind, I knew that you would be asking that question, is my father wrote 4 books, 3 of them as this solo author. The first was a book called Man Unfolding. The second was Survival of the Wisest. And the third was, actually, it was the third book he wrote with my brother, and I'll come back to that. The last book was Anatomy of Reality, Merging of Intuition and Reason. The third book he wrote with my youngest brother, Jonathan, and that was called World Population and Human Values, A New Reality. After my father's death in 1995, in more recent years, Jonathan has updated and revised that book, and it's now been published as A New Reality, Human Evolution for a Sustainable Future. So I would say that would be a very accessible book to get a sense of sort of the arc of my father's thinking. So I would put that out as a recommendation for people to take a look at.
Okay. And this podcast is about events and personalities from the history of science. What is your favorite moment from the history of science?
Okay, I thought about that one since I knew you were going to be asking it. And what has come into my mind is my favorite moment hasn't yet come. The moment that we fully understand consciousness and are able to use that understanding in a practical way to help accelerate the process towards becoming a really fully constructively interdependent species, That will be my favorite moment in the Fisher's hands.
Okay. Well, thank you. You know, it was such a pleasure talking to you, and this opportunity, just to talk to you with someone from the family of Dr. Jonas Salk is such a privilege and an honor, and that I would remember forever. So thank you so much, and once again, um, you know. I just wanted to say, thank you to your family, and especially to your father, for his contribution to humanity. It's just unparalleled, and I just hope, like you said, that there's things that future researchers could take away, from his life and work, and apply it to their work, and b- together we can all march towards a better world. But thank you so much for taking this time this afternoon. It was such an honor and a pleasure talking to you.
But Robert, thank you so much for this opportunity.